Hey there, Danny here from 1 Minute Podcast Tips and Be a Better Podcaster. Today I want to talk about the difference between listeners, downloads, and followers because with so many different analytic platforms to choose from, so your podcast hosting company, Apple Podcast with their Podcast Connect feature, Spotify for creators, etc. There's so much, and YouTube, obviously, if you've got video podcasting, there's so many different platforms that can pull analytics in. It can be a little bit confusing. Now, for this one, I'm just going to use audio because that's primarily what I am. I know I do some videos now and again, but I'm primarily an audio only or an audio first podcaster. So I'm just going to use audio analytics for this, just to give you an idea. But it's really simple to differentiate between listeners, downloads, and followers, and why each one matters. The three options I'm going to look at are Captivate hosting platform, because that's where I host my podcast. And full disclaimer, I am the head of podcaster support and experience there, so I am going to use their platform. But that's what I'm going to use for the analytics from a hosting platform point of view. Then I'll look at Podcast Connect for Apple and Spotify for creators for your Spotify analytics. Now, quick heads up, the Spotify for Creators dashboard I'll look at is the podcaster portal for podcasts that are hosted on a different platform. Spotify, confusingly, calls their own hosting platform Spotify for Creators too. So it can be a bit confusing, but the portal that I'll be using is for when you host your show with a different host. So Captivate, Buzzsprout, Libsyn, etc. So let's have a look and we'll go through what each one means. Okay, so as you can see, I'm now in the Captivate dashboard and I'm looking at the analytics section under Insights. And you can see here, I've got two data points. I've got unique listeners and I've got downloads. So just to clarify, with listeners and downloads, it's important to understand what the difference is. So I know a lot of people, myself included, talk about downloads not being the most important metric, and that's 100% true because with features like auto download on podcast apps, for example, you can have a download that's sent to your phone or your listening device and never listened to. But with listeners or unique listeners, that gives you a better idea as to people having actually listened to the podcast. So on hosting platforms, and most hosting platforms will be the same, but obviously this is Captivate's dashboard and analytics. But a unique listener, as you see, if I hover over the little helper tool, a unique listener is defined as someone that's listened from the same IP address and the same device within the reporting time frame. So if I was looking at the last 28 days or the last 7 days, etc., it would be for that reporting time frame. And this is really because Captivate is fully certified to the IAB v2.2 certification. This will tell you that someone, let's say I listened to this podcast episode and I'm in Toronto, downtown Toronto, listening on my Pixel phone and using Pocket Cast, for example, to listen. All that information would define me as a unique listener at that time. Now, if I was to stop listening and jump in my car or jump on the subway or something and go to work, go shopping, go to a game, whatever, and then I restarted listening, that would count as a second unique listener because it's based on the IP address. So the first IP address was where I was downtown Toronto. If I've gone to North York in Toronto for whatever reason, that is now a separate IP address. And so that will be classed as a second unique listener. It's still me, but it's now classed as a second unique listener based on that IP address. So that's why sometimes for a single download, you can have multiple unique listeners, which is the same person for that one download. Now, just to clarify again, a download for IAB certification is when someone presses play on a podcast app or a web player, embedded player, etc., and listens for at least 60 seconds, or downloads enough data to their device to be able to listen back for 60 seconds afterwards. If it's under 60 seconds, it won't be counted. And with IAB certification, especially 2.2, that helps get rid of bots, etc., automated scripts, banned or blocked IP addresses. So it will make the analytics a lot more accurate. So as I mentioned, a download is when someone downloads or presses play and listens for at least 60 seconds or downloads enough data to the device to be able to listen for at least 60 seconds afterwards. So from a hosting platform point of view, unique listener and downloads is the data you would look at there. And ideally, what you want to be looking at is when you're looking at your listener behavior. So you can see here, this is my downloads and listeners for the last 28 days. Ideally, you'd want the unique listener data, which is this pink chart here, to roughly match the download data, because that means people are listening to the episode once they've downloaded it. You will get little differences now and again, obviously. And if you see a spike like this, generally that's when someone has got auto download enabled on their podcast app and they've started following you. And we'll talk about followers in a short while. And what will happen there is, depending on what their settings are on the podcast app, if you've got 100 episodes on your podcast and that new follower has unlimited automatic downloads set up for each new show they follow, then if you've got 100 episodes on your podcast, that one new follower will equate to 100 downloads for that episode or for your podcast on that day of reporting. So you can see here, for example, on the April 2nd, I had 40 unique listeners and I had 222 downloads. So that dictates to me I've got about 140 episodes, I think, on this podcast if I include bonus episodes. That would dictate to me I've got a brand new follower that did have auto download, or maybe even two new followers that had auto downloads and they've only got 100 downloads set as their max auto download setting on the podcast app. So anyway, this is what downloads are on hosting companies, and this is what unique listeners are on hosting companies. However, it can be different based on the platform you're looking at. So if I hook over to Podcast Connect, which is Apple's podcaster portal, and look at the same information, Apple and Spotify give different information than your hosting company. There's some information and some data sets that do sort of overlap each other, but generally Apple has different reporting from your hosting company, and Spotify has different information again from your hosting company, and Spotify and Apple have different information from each other, just to make it so much fun trying to get all your analytics together and understood. But anywho, if you look at the 1 Minute Podcast Tips dashboard on Apple Podcast Connect, it'll tell you some information here like followers, listeners, engaged listeners, and plays. You'll notice there's no mention of downloads. There's no mention of unique listeners, but again, the listeners in that can tie similar to that. But on the followers, and again, we'll talk about followers shortly, but followers is basically, how many people follow this particular podcast on Apple Podcast. Listeners, engaged listeners, and plays give very different information from your hosting company. So it's important to understand what the difference is so you're not counting data that would be skewed. So if you look at plays here, you can see I've got on Apple Podcasts for this particular podcast, I've got just over 3,000 plays all time. However, if I look at the plays information, that tells me the number of plays on unique devices where the play duration is greater than 0 seconds, which isn't really a worthwhile metric. And that means I could press play on Apple Podcast, stop listening after 1 second, and get zero value or zero, listening time really from that episode, but Apple are still going to count that 1 second as a play. So a lot of times when you see people talking about how many plays they've got on Apple Podcasts, you can kind of negate that number because it's not really a valid metric. At least for me anyway, it's not really a valid metric. Instead, what you want to be looking at is engaged listeners, because what engaged listeners does is it shows you the number of unique devices that played at least 20 minutes or 40% of an episode within a single session. Pausing or stopping an episode does not count as starting a new session, so it needs to be continuous. But 20 minutes or 40%, that's a good barometer of people actually listening to your episode. So that's great. If I was telling a podcaster what data to look at on Apple Podcasts, I would immediately point them to engaged listeners. If you look at the listener data, this is the number of unique devices that have played more than 0 seconds of an episode. So again, not really a valid metric as such. The followers and engaged listeners are the ones you want to be looking at. And this is just a top level overview of the analytics. You can go a lot deeper. You can see at the top here, I've got trends, episodes, performance. And I'll do another video about getting deeper into your Apple and your Spotify analytics. And that really lets you show drop-off time, episode consumption percentage, all the good stuff that you want to be looking at when it comes to understanding how your podcast is performing. But on Podcast Connect for Apple, I would look at followers and I would look at engaged listeners. Now, Spotify is a different one as well. So if we hook over to the Spotify for Creators dashboard, and again, as I mentioned, this is the Spotify for Creators podcaster portal for shows that are hosted on a different hosting platform. It's not Spotify for Creators. The hosting platform used to be Anchor, two different things, but you'll get similar data inside that dashboard. But if I go over here, it gives me a quick overview of how the podcast is doing. But when I go to analytics, again, compared to your hosting platform and compared to Apple Podcast Connect, it's got different information again. So once again, you won't see any downloads or unique listeners, etc. on Spotify for Creators. What you will see is starts, streams, listeners, followers, impressions. So impressions are basically how many times your podcast has been seen within the Spotify ecosystem. So it shows you the number of times your show or any of your episodes was shown to anyone on Spotify over the last 30 days. Now, impressions, I don't really go for impressions as being a really super valuable metric, because all that's saying is if I've got my Spotify podcast app open and let's say I've got 10 podcasts in my viewing window as I'm sort of scrolling or looking at, a new podcast to listen to, all 10 of these are an impression. So because they're in my view screen or my viewing window, I've seen them, or allegedly I've seen them. My phone display is displaying them to me, so that's impression. So it doesn't mean that any action was taken with that impression. It just means it was visible on a screen to someone on Spotify at a given time. So as I mentioned, it's not really something I would really worry about. Now, going back to the actual data, if you look at starts, this is very similar to Apple Plays. So it's a number of times any episode in your catalogue was played on Spotify for 0 seconds or more. Again, for me, it's not a valid metric because, again, I could start, press and play and then stop after 1 second, and that's counted as a start. And it's not really, giving me, as a podcaster, it's not giving me an engaged audience or a captive audience. It's just telling me people have started, not telling me how long they've listened to it. Streams, on the other hand, this is very similar to the IAB certification. So streams is the number of times any episode in your catalogue was played on Spotify for at least 60 seconds. Again, goes back to that IAB certification, where if you press play on a podcast app or a web player, or download enough data and listen back for at least 60 seconds afterwards, that will be counted as a download. So a stream on Spotify is probably the closest thing to an IAB download. Listeners is the number of distinct people. So this is kind of similar to unique listeners for your hosting company, but it's the number of distinct people on Spotify that started an episode in your catalog. Now, again, it's useful, but it's not something that I'd see as a hugely valid metric because it's on about people that have started an episode. And if you remember, over on starts, that just counts anything from 0 seconds or more. So it could be 1 second, it could be 2 seconds, it could be the whole episode. What you want to be looking at instead is listeners. So as I mentioned, streams is really good, but also, not listeners, is followers. And let's move on to followers now because we've sort of broken down what the downloads, unique listeners, plays, starts, streams, and followers, listeners are, etc. Or engaged listeners, I should say, on Apple and Spotify. But followers is the third metric. So the followers they're kind of like the old subscribers. So this is someone that's added your podcast to their podcast app of choice. So Spotify, Apple, Pocket Cast, Anytime app, whichever app they use, they've added it to their library. So anytime a new episode drops, it will be sent to them immediately. And they'll get it usually within a few minutes of your episode gone live. Whereas anybody that's not following your show, it could take whatever the ingestion period is for a new episode to go onto Spotify, Apple, etc. Sometimes that's fairly quickly. Sometimes it can take up to an hour. Sometimes a lot more than that, depending on how busy these apps are, how many new episodes have gone through, all that kind of good stuff. So followers is a good way to see how many people are actually subscribed to your podcast. So you can see here on Spotify, there's 54. If I go back to Apple, I've got 85 there. And then if I wanted to look at how many other followers I've got, there's a great option called Rephonic that if you claim your show on Rephonic, and I've got a video elsewhere, I'll link to that in the description. If you claim your show on Rephonic, that will tell you how many listeners or followers you've got on other podcast apps. So it's a pretty cool way to get an idea of how many people are actually subscribed to your podcast. And that's normally why you see if you look at your podcast hosting company, that's why you would normally see spikes on episode drop dates. So you can see here on Captivate, show episode publish dates. If I do that, I can see here I've got spikes. Each time I drop a new episode, I've got that spike there. These are probably the initial spike there are the followers or subscribers, if you like, to my podcast. And that tells me, again, it's a good barometer of identifying how many people are following and getting your show as soon as it drops, or getting your episodes as soon as they drop, versus how many just sort of check it out based on you sharing on social media, newsletters, referrals, all that kind of good stuff. So from an analytics point of view, I would say that if you're looking at downloads, it's a starting point. It's not the be all and end all. You can't have a listen without a download, so it is important to get downloads. But because, as I mentioned, because of auto downloads and bots and scripts, etc., that number can be gamed or it can be a bit skewed. What you're looking for is unique listeners, followers, and engaged listeners or streams or any other metric like that, where it's at least 60 seconds based on the IB certification, or based on the Spotify stream, or 20% of the 40, or the 20 minutes or 40% of the episode for Apple, for example, for engaged listeners. Any data that you can get that goes beyond the download analysis and looks at actually listeners, looks at listen through, consumption percentage, drop off, where people are skipping, where they're replaying, etc. That's the information you want to be looking at to really talk to space sponsors, advertisers, or other podcasters if you're going to do trailer swaps, etc., or promo swaps. That's the data that you want to be giving them to really show how effective your podcast is and why they should partner with you. And it just gives you a good idea as well as to how your podcast is growing, where you need to work on, and where you can sort of step back because that marketing or that podcast app is doing really well for you, for example. So I hope this has helped. I hope it's cleared up the difference between downloads, listeners, followers, etc. And if you want more information like this, obviously follow this channel, do the old like, subscribe, the bell, all that cool stuff that you normally do on YouTube. And you can follow for free for the audio version, you can follow for free at 1minutepodcasttips.com. Until the next time, happy podcasting.